Hello and welcome to this video lecture as part of the Mini Psychology School series with the Context Program, which is the collaborative network for training and excellence in psychotraumatology. My name is Áine Travers. I am a Context Research Fellow, and today I'm going to be presenting on the issue of intimate partner violence in conflict-affected settings with reference to the specific case of Northern Ireland. The research informing this presentation was a collaboration between the University of Southern Denmark, Ulster University, and the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, the PBNI is responsible for supervising perpetrators who are on probation in the community and for preparing incarcerated offenders for their release. This role involves conducting periodic risk assessments based on empirically derived risk factors for recidivistic or repeat criminality. It also involves providing group and individual interventions aimed at targeting these risk factors and also targeting protective factors to ultimately reduce offenders' likelihood to reoffend in the community. So the overall goal of this research was to produce a set of actionable recommendations that could be incorporated into the PBNI's work on risk assessment and intervention specifically for partner violence. So with this presentation, I want to provide you with some basic knowledge of the social and political context of Northern Ireland as a conflict-affected setting. I want to explore how violence in the private or domestic sphere relates and in many ways overlaps with violence that takes place in the public sphere. I want to describe some of the risk factors for perpetration of domestic violence in the post-conflict setting. And I want to provide you with some information about how these risk factors might be incorporated practically into the work of organisations such as the Probation Board for Northern Ireland. In relation to terminology, the definition of domestic violence that we're working from in this presentation is taken from the Istanbul Convention, which is the main European convention that details European states' responsibilities when it comes to preventing and responding to domestic violence. So that definition states that domestic violence means all acts of physical, sexual, psychological, or economic violence that occur within the family or domestic unit or between former or current spouses or partners, whether or not the perpetrator shares or has shared the same residence with the victim. So we will focus upon the subtype of domestic violence that takes place between partners, which is termed partner violence or intimate partner violence. However, we acknowledge that there is a high degree of overlap and co-occurrence between partner violence and other types of domestic violence. For example, it's known that perpetrators of partner violence are very likely to also be violent towards children, and also that children's witnessing of domestic violence in the home constitutes a form of emotional abuse in itself. Domestic and partner violence are sometimes referred to as gender-based violence. Gender-based violence is an overarching term that refers to any violence that is disproportionately experienced by women or that is perpetrated on the basis of stereotypical gender roles. So domestic and partner violence are referred to as gender-based because these types of violence are disproportionately experienced by women and are the most common types of violence experienced by women. The World Health Organization estimates that 30% of ever partnered women worldwide have experienced intimate partner violence. And this figure is higher in the more economically disadvantaged regions such as Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. There is also higher prevalence of partner violence in areas affected by war and armed conflict. For several years now, researchers have been gathering qualitative evidence and evidence from practice demonstrating the links between armed conflict and partner violence. I've cited just a few examples here from Northern Ireland, from Lebanon, Uganda, and Sri Lanka. Research has also begun to investigate this link quantitatively, and I've cited two recent studies here, Kelly et al. 2018 and Murphy et al. From 2019 from Liberia and South Sudan that have established this link and shown that where there is armed conflict, women are more likely to report also experiencing partner violence. The context of interest here, which is Northern Ireland, has a long history of violent conflict, dating back several hundred years to the Ulster plantations of the 17th century. But when I refer to civil conflict in this presentation, I'm referring to the conflict of the 20th century, which began in late 1968 and lasted for 30 years. Colloquially referred to in the region as the Troubles. The Troubles was precipitated by a civil rights movement led by the predominantly Catholic and nationalist minority in response to discrimination experienced by that minority by the predominantly Protestant and loyalist government and police force. The civil rights movement was met with violence and brutality, which caused tensions in the region to flare and violence to increase, eventually resulting in the deployment of British troops to Northern Ireland, which further exacerbated and prolonged the conflict. The conflict was what is sometimes referred to as low-level war, involving paramilitary groups. 3,600 people were killed, 30,000 people were injured. Peace was achieved in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement by the governments of the United Kingdom and Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement set out that Northern Ireland would remain under the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom, so long as that was the will of the majority population there. So for the most part, this ended the public violence in Northern Ireland, although remnants of the conflict still do persist to this day. For example, paramilitary groups, particularly in disadvantaged communities, continue to administer punishment beatings for offences such as antisocial behaviour. In the last reporting period of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, there were 16 paramilitary-style shootings and 56 paramilitary-style assaults recorded. The consequences of the Troubles for the population of Northern Ireland have been serious and enduring. There's been a significant adverse impact on the mental health of the population. These two epidemiological studies by Bunting et al. 2013 and Karam et al. 2014 demonstrate a very high rate of post-traumatic stress disorder in the general population. The study by Karam et al., based on the World Mental Health Survey data of the World Health Organization, showed that Northern Ireland had the highest proportion of post-traumatic stress disorder of 20 countries surveyed, including countries that have also had experience of conflict, such as Lebanon. The study by Bunting et al., based on the same data, indicated a 12-month prevalence of over 5% PTSD in the population and a lifetime prevalence of almost 9%. The same data indicated significant rates of other mental health problems as well as PTSD, including mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse. There is also significant unmet need for mental health services, long hospital waiting lists compared to the rest of the UK, significant rate of suicide, and the research conducted by Bunting and colleagues has linked these mental health problems significantly with the civil conflict. So individuals with direct experience of the civil conflict are more likely to display a range of adverse mental health outcomes. As well as this, police reports of domestic abuse have increased significantly in the post-conflict period in Northern Ireland. This graph is taken from a PSNI report, and it shows the rate of domestic abuse crimes represented by the dotted line and domestic abuse incidents represented by the continuous purple line since the beginning of record keeping in the 2004-2005 reporting period. So you can see from these graphs that the general trend has been increase year on year, reaching an all-time high in the last reporting period. It's likely that some of this increase in reported domestic abuse in the post-conflict period can be attributed to increased reporting as trust in the police forces strengthened in peacetime. It's difficult to find cross-nationally comparable data on domestic violence, and particularly because large cross-national surveys, such as the groundbreaking survey conducted by the EU Fundamental Rights Agency in 2014, tend to treat the UK as an aggregate whole, so that precludes comparison of the prevalence of partner violence in Northern Ireland with England, Scotland, or Wales. However, there is data to suggest that domestic violence is a particularly significant problem in Northern Ireland. For example, despite that big increase in reported domestic violence, data from crime victimization surveys suggests that domestic violence is still a significantly underreported crime in Northern Ireland. One victimization survey found that police were unaware of 63.4% of victims' worst offences. As well as this, Eurostat data has suggested that Northern Ireland has the joint highest rate of intimate partner homicide in Europe. It's tied with Romania at 0.43 per 100,000 inhabitants. So this is considerably higher than the rate of 0.13 in England and Wales and 0.17 in Scotland. And so the latest police statistics available on domestic violence in Northern Ireland from 2019 show yet another increase, and the statistics are now up to 31,705 domestic incidents in that year. So that represents one incident every 17 minutes that are responded to by the police. And victims in Northern Ireland have fewer legislative protections than victims in England, Scotland, Wales, and the Republic of Ireland. Most notably, the offence of coercive control is not yet criminalized. And coercive control is a term coined by Evan Stark to represent the system of domination and control usually enforced through the threat of violence by domestic perpetrators. Domestic abuse can be difficult to prosecute and criminalize because of its often long-term, repetitive use of low-level controlling actions. So criminalization of coercive control is a very important component of the criminal justice response to enable victims to access justice. So its criminalisation in Northern Ireland was first delayed by the breakdown of the power sharing executive in Northern Ireland in 2017. Following that, an attempt to introduce the legislation via Westminster was delayed by the Brexit impasse. The newly functioning executive has now indicated the intention to implement the legislation in the coming months. And this will be an important step forward in terms of victim protection in Northern Ireland. There are several possible contributing factors to those worrying statistics that I outlined on the previous few slides. Greater reporting as trust in the police is strengthened in the post-conflict period is one likely contributor. And this has been shown in a very groundbreaking series of qualitative interviews conducted by Monica McWilliams and her colleagues. And they interviewed survivors of domestic abuse in Northern Ireland both during and after the conflict. And indeed they found that survivors during the conflict had a very low level of trust in the police to take reports of domestic violence seriously and to have the capacity to adequately respond to the reports. And then the interviews conducted in peacetime certainly showed a marked increase in women's willingness to approach the police and their sense of the police's willingness and capacity to respond. Another potential contributing factor that has been suggested has been that the armed conflict in the community creates something of a culture of violence and a desensitization to violent acts. A sociological theory suggests that when a peace agreement is signed and public violence ends, that violence doesn't simply stop or disappear, but that the violence rather changes shape and begins to take place elsewhere, so in this case in the domestic sphere or behind closed doors. And there's good reason to believe that trauma and its associated emotional dysregulation has a significant role to play in the increase in prevalence of domestic abuse in conflict-affected settings, and that the related issue of substance abuse among perpetrators may reduce the threshold for those violent acts to be carried out. These are just some excerpts from those qualitative studies that I mentioned on the previous slide, conducted by Monica McWilliams and her colleagues in 1993 and then again in 2018, that really outline the links between public and private violence in Northern Ireland. You can see here from this first quote, the availability of weapons to domestic abusers was a significant exacerbating factor on victims' domestic abuse experiences. In the second quote, we can see reflected how conservative religious values may have made it more difficult for victims to leave violent relationships. And finally, we see reflected the point that we touched on earlier about trust in police and people feeling that they weren't able to approach police during the time of conflict. These qualitative insights are clearly vital to our understanding of how domestic violence occurs in the context of Northern Ireland and for the design of victim support services and preventive efforts. But we currently lack data from the perpetrator side on perpetrator-related dynamics and quantitative data about how these risk factors actually operate. So from the perspective of trauma, we know already that childhood trauma is one of the best known risk factors for perpetration of domestic abuse in later life. And this includes trauma, particularly such as physical abuse or witnessing domestic violence in the home. And this link is traditionally explained via social learning theories, which posit that children learn behavioral scripts by observing the behaviors of their caregivers and then integrating those behaviors within their own repertoires as acceptable ways for achieving social ends. However, it's now widely accepted that such social learning theories fail to account fully for this link or this relationship, in that they don't explain why most people who have experienced childhood abuse don't go on to become perpetrators in later life. Additionally, other research has also identified an increase in perpetration rates among groups such as military veterans, which seems to suggest that war-related trauma, community violence, and related PTSD could also confer increased risk. And newer models have been developed, such as the neurodevelopmental model proposed by Bruce Perry, that really account for a much broader array of the emotional, regulatory, and cognitive processes that are interrupted by experiencing a range of different types of trauma. However, this link between war-related PTSD or trauma and perpetration is still somewhat unclear because certain military personnel are more likely to display this link than others, and also military personnel are more likely to have a history of childhood trauma than the average person. So it could be that we're seeing more of an impact of an accumulation of adversity rather than simply an effect of the war-related trauma or PTSD in itself. So my colleagues and I designed a study to first examine whether exposure to multiple types of traumas would increase the risk for more severe types of domestic violence perpetration. The second part of our analysis was concerned with breaking these traumatic exposures into two categories: those that were related to childhood maltreatment experiences, or those types of traumas likely to be related to the civil conflict in Northern Ireland, and to see whether either of those two trauma types would confer unique risk for any of our 5 offending outcomes. Our sample was a group of 405 partner violent perpetrators who had been enrolled in behaviour change programs of the PBNI in the last 10 years. We carried out case file analysis to code for traumatic experiences and to code for severe offending behaviours, which were based on best international evidence of risk markers for serious and fatal domestic abuse. So the outcomes that we coded for were the perpetration of injurious domestic violence, sexual violence, use of a weapon in a domestic context, breach of a non-molestation order or restraining order, and having a past history of police involvement for domestic abuse. Here's the reference for the study if anyone is interested. And what we actually found: 73.3% of individuals reported exposure to at least one traumatic event. Substance abuse problems were extremely common in the files, reported by almost 90% of offenders. Evidence of probable mental health problems was also common, and this was present in 63.5% of files. And here's just the frequencies of the traumatic experiences contained in the study, and we can see here quite a high prevalence of those experiences that may be likely to be related to the conflict or post-conflict setting, such as being attacked or threatened with a weapon. And in our regression analyses, we found that having experienced multiple types of trauma was significantly associated with the two outcomes of perpetrating injurious domestic violence and sexual domestic violence. We found that each additional traumatic experience was associated with a 24% increase in the odds of perpetrating injurious violence and a 28% increased odds in perpetrating sexual violence, although we found no association between multiple trauma and the other three offending outcomes. In the second part of our analysis, we found that conflict-related trauma alone was not independently associated with increased risk of any of the offending outcomes, but childhood maltreatment was significantly associated with perpetration of injurious domestic violence. We found substance abuse to be a significant predictor of three of our offending outcomes: use of a weapon in a domestic context, perpetration of injurious violence, and having a past history of police involvement for domestic abuse. The presence of a mental health problem, on the other hand, did not confer additional risk for any of the offending outcomes. And so what these findings seem to imply is that cumulative or multiple trauma and substance abuse do appear to act as risk factors for some types of particularly serious domestic violence perpetration in Northern Ireland. However, conflict-related trauma alone does not appear to confer unique risk. It's likely that conflict-related trauma, if it does act as a risk factor, acts as a risk factor mainly in the context of pre-existing vulnerabilities, such as a past history of childhood maltreatment. Just to mention a couple of important caveats in relation to this study before I go on to discuss some potential implications. It's important to note that this sample on which this research is based is highly selective. Because we were required to sample based on individuals who were attending behavioral intervention programs, our eligibility criteria for participants are restricted by the eligibility criteria of those programs. So, for example, those programs require individuals to reach a certain level of risk. All of the participants had perpetrated partner violence to the extent that they were assessed as medium to high risk by their probation officer. As well as this, the screening process requires that anyone with an active, severe mental health problem or substance abuse problem that might prevent their participation in the program were also screened out. So that's important from our point of view, because we need to bear in mind that we may be missing some of the most disordered or chaotic perpetrators. The data is cross-sectional, so all the information was gathered at the same point in time. And so to really assess the causal relationship between traumatic experiences and our other risk factors, we'll need longitudinal data, and ideally longitudinal data that's based on standard measures, measuring the constructs of interest. Because of the nature of our secondary data analysis, our data involved coding of case file data to form a data set of categorical variables, and therefore we had reduced variability in comparison to what we would have if we had used continuous measures of our constructs. So to touch on some of the ways that these findings could potentially be applied to practice of organizations such as the PPNI, we can talk about intervention and strategy. The intervention program currently in use for partner violent offenders across the UK is entitled Building Better Relationships, and this is a standard program based on the general aggression model. And all work on partner violence prevention and response in Northern Ireland is underpinned by a 7-year strategy that began in 2016, but this has been criticised by Monica McWilliams and Jessica Doyle for failing to attend to aspects of the post-conflict setting and how this might affect perpetration and victimisation. So one way in which these interventions and strategies might better tailor themselves to the post-conflict setting from the perpetration side could involve increased focus on trauma and related substance abuse as risk factors. Efforts to incorporate these risk factors into existing interventions should be informed by and build upon existing international research in these areas. For example, Taft and colleagues in the US have developed and begun to test an intervention entitled Strength at Home, which is a CBT trauma-informed intervention specifically designed for military veterans. So in their randomized control trial of 2016, Taft and colleagues found that the Strength at Home program produced a greater reduction in partner violence over time than the comparison intervention. However, differences in recidivism between the two groups had disappeared by the point of 3-month follow-up. Another approach was described and tested by Pasquale-Leone et al. In 2011, and this was a test of an approach titled Relating Without Violence, which was an emotion-focused treatment for partner-violent individuals. And this treatment incorporated EMDR treatment for trauma-exposed individuals. EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and is an evidence-based treatment for trauma. And this treatment produced an effect, a significant reduction in recidivistic partner violence up to 8 months follow-up. However, the design of that study was quasi-experimental, and so some influence relating to factors related to group allocation can't be ruled out. In relation to substance abuse is something that is very challenging to treat in the forensic setting, and some potential options for treatment have been described by Andrews and Bonta in the context of their risk-need responsivity model. And these include group modalities such as Alcohol Anonymous formats, and some tests of initial CBT-style interventions such as an integrated CBT treatment have shown promising results in the shorter term. But in this area, sustainability of results is a very important issue, and future research really needs to develop this in terms of interventions, pushing out their effects and maintaining their effects into the longer term. And so here I've provided you with just the main references that I've referred to throughout this presentation if you're interested in doing further reading on this topic. And so finally, I would just like to acknowledge the support of the funders of the Context Programme, the European Union Horizon 2020 programme. And I would like to thank you for your time and attention today.